I was trying to be efficient. It was the first truly cold night of autumn, a bitter wind knifing down the concrete canyons of the financial district, and the usual 5-block walk from my office to the subway felt like a trek across the tundra. My nose was numb, my ears ached, and the thought of the crowded, humid train was the only thing pulling me forward. That's when I remembered the cut-through. An old, half-forgotten pedestrian alley that sliced diagonally through the block, shaving a good 3 minutes off the journey. I'd used it a handful of times in daylight, a narrow passage of stained brick and dripping air conditioner units between two hulking banks. At night, it was less appealing, but the promise of getting out of the wind and shortening my misery was too strong. I turned off the main avenue, the roar of traffic dulling to a muffled growl behind me. The alley was even darker than I remembered, the sole security light above a metal service door flickering with a palsied, intermittent buzz. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the tight space. The wind, now channeled and accelerated, became a low, moaning whistle. I hurried, head down, hands jammed in my pockets, counting the steps until I'd emerge on the cross street. 100 paces, maybe. I was about halfway when the flickering light finally gave up and died, plunging the alley into near-total darkness. I swore under my breath, slowing to a shuffle, one hand trailing the cold, slimy brick wall to my right to keep my bearings. I counted my steps. 70. 80. 90. The cross street should be right there, a splash of light at the end of this tunnel. At 100 steps, my outstretched hand met not open air, but another wall. Cold, smooth stone. Not brick. I stopped, confused. Had I veered? I took a step back, turned my body, and felt in front of me. It was a corner. A sharp, 90-degree corner where the alley should have been straight. The wind's moan cut off abruptly, replaced by a dead, airless silence. My heart began a slow, heavy thud in my chest. This was wrong. Completely wrong. The cut-through was a straight shot. There were no turns. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with cold and sudden fear. The screen's light was a shocking blue-white intrusion. No signal. But I opened the flashlight app and swung the beam around. I was not in the alley. I was at the intersection of two narrow, cobbled streets. The buildings on either side were not glass and steel towers, but soot-blackened stone edifices with ornate, Gothic-inspired facades. Wrought iron lampposts stood at each corner, unlit, their glass globes murky with grime. The architecture was old, pre-war old, but it looked pristine in its decay. Not abandoned, but preserved. The silence was absolute, a woolen blanket smothering all sound. My own breath plumed in the frigid air, the only movement in the still world. Disorientation washed over me, a nausea of place. I knew this city. I had lived here for 12 years. These streets did not exist. I turned, shining the light back the way I had come. The passage behind me was not the alley I'd entered. It was another of these narrow, cobbled lanes, receding into blackness. The service door, the dripping AC units, the graffiti, all gone. Replaced by a row of tall, narrow doors of dark, scarred wood, each with a tarnished brass number plate. Panic, thin and sharp, rose in my throat. I had to get back. I turned to the right, the direction that should have led, more or less, back towards the main avenue. I started walking, my phone light bouncing eerily off the facades. The street curved gently. I followed it, my pace increasing. The buildings were monotonous in their dark grandeur, but not identical. One had gargoyles leering from its cornice. Another had windows shaped like pointed arches, blind with black shutters. No light showed from within any of them. The cobbles were uneven, and I stumbled, the sound of my scuffing foot deafening in the quiet. After a few minutes of walking, the street straightened. And there, ahead of me, was a familiar sight, the flickering security light, the stained brick, the humming AC unit. The alley. My alley. Relief, so potent it made me weak, flooded through me. I almost ran the last few yards, bursting from the mouth of the alley onto the familiar cross street with its bright storefronts and passing taxis. The wind hit me again, but it was a welcome, real sensation. I leaned against a lamppost, breathing hard, laughing at myself. A trick of the dark. A moment of profound disorientation. That was all. I took the subway home, the incident already softening into a weird story I'd tell my friends. But in my apartment, as I poured a drink, the unease returned, cold and persistent. The details were too sharp. The feel of the cobbles. The specific, oily smell of the old stone. The absolute, vacuum-sealed silence. The next evening, driven by a compulsive need to prove it was a fluke, I went back. I stood at the entrance to the cut-through in the dying afternoon light. It was just an alley. I walked through it, slowly, deliberately. It was straight. It emerged exactly where it was supposed to. I felt foolish. A week later, working late again, I found myself standing at the same alley entrance. The wind was up, similar to that first night. A part of me whispered not to, but a stronger, more stubborn part needed closure. I walked in. The flickering light was out again. I turned on my phone flashlight before the darkness could become complete. I walked the same 100 paces. And at the end, my beam illuminated not the cross street, but a stone wall. And a corner. My blood turned to ice. No. Not again. I shone the light down the new branch. It was the same. The cobbles. The wrought iron lamps. The silent, Gothic facades. But this time, it was different. I recognized the building on the corner. It was the one with the gargoyles. I was back in the same place, but I had entered from a different point. The geometry was impossible. Terror stripped away any thought of experimentation. I just ran. I picked a direction and sprinted, the beam of my light jerking wildly, my breath sobbing in my chest. I took turns at random, left, right, left. The streets were a labyrinth, a twisting, turning maze of silent stone. I never saw a person. Never saw a light in a window. The only sound was my own frantic passage and the hammering of my heart. Then, I saw something familiar. A modern fire escape. A splash of faded graffiti. I skidded to a halt, panting. I was in an alley. A different alley, but a normal one, with dumpsters and cracked asphalt. I could see traffic lights at the end of it. I stumbled out onto a busy street, gasping, drawing stares from passers-by. I was 10 blocks from where I started. The cut-through alley was far behind me. I have not tried the cut-through again. I take the long way, every single time, even in the rain. But the city feels different now. I find myself looking at buildings, really looking at them. And sometimes, in certain lights, from certain angles, the modern facade seems to slip. Just for a second. I'll see the ghost of older stonework, the suggestion of a pointed arch where a rectangular window should be. I'll turn a corner in my own neighborhood, a corner I've turned 1,000 times, and for a disorienting heartbeat, the buildings don't look quite right. The proportions are off. The shadows fall the wrong way. I think the city is layered. I think our familiar grid of streets and steel is just the topmost page. And sometimes, through tears in the paper, a dark alley, a moment of inattention, a specific state of mind, you can slip to the layer beneath. A quieter, older, waiting city. A city that doesn't follow the same map. Its streets don't care about our right angles. They curve. They shift. They rearrange themselves when you're not looking. Last night, I dreamt I was walking home. I turned a corner onto my own street. The brownstones were gone. In their place were the silent, soot-blackened stone edifices, the unlit wrought iron lamps. The street stretched before me, endless and quiet, and at the far end, under a lone, flickering gas lamp that most certainly was not there in the waking world, a tall, narrow figure stood, facing away from me. I woke up sweating. And now, every corner I approach fills me with a low, humming dread. Because I know it's not a matter of avoiding one particular alley. It's a matter of geometry. And in the geometry of that other city, every corner is a potential threshold. Every turn is a gamble. And the buildings there have a terrible, patient ability to shift when your back is turned, to close off your retreat, to welcome you deeper into a map that was never meant for you. The park was my shortcut, a sliver of manicured green and winding paths that saved me a good 15 minutes on the walk home from the library. I'd taken it 1,000 times, day and night. I knew its rhythms, the old men playing chess by the fountain until dusk, the joggers with their determined faces, the scatter of dog walkers in the last of the light. By 9 p.m., it was usually empty, just me, the occasional rustle of a possum in the bushes, and the reliable glow of the lampposts that lined the main path like evenly spaced sentinels. That night, a Tuesday, the air was crisp with the first real bite of autumn, and a fingernail moon hung in a clear, black sky. I was lost in thought, replaying a difficult conversation, my footsteps a steady, solitary beat on the asphalt. It was the darkness that snapped me out of it. A patch of profound black where there should have been a pool of warm, sodium orange light. I stopped walking. The lamppost halfway down the straight stretch, the one that stood opposite the old, boarded-up public toilets, was out. Not flickering. Not damaged. It was just dark. The glass globe was a dull, sightless eye. This was unusual. The park maintenance was meticulous, burned-out bulbs were replaced within a day. I hesitated for only a second before continuing. It was just a dark patch. I'd walked through a million dark patches. As I entered the sphere of its absence, the temperature dropped noticeably. The chill wasn't just the lack of artificial warmth, it was a deeper, damper cold, like stepping into a cellar. The sounds of the distant city traffic seemed to warp and fade, as if someone had turned down the treble on the world, leaving only a low, bass hum. My own footsteps became muffled. I picked up my pace, my eyes fixed on the next lit post 50 yards ahead, a beacon of normalcy. Then I saw her. She was standing exactly where the lamppost should have been, centered on the concrete plinth that raised it a few inches above the path. At first, my mind, struggling to categorize, insisted she was the lamppost, a trick of shadow, a bizarre piece of topiary. But no. She was a woman. Or the shape of one. She wore a long, dark coat that fell to her ankles, and her posture was unnaturally straight, arms held stiffly at her sides. Her face was tilted down, shadowed by what might have been the brim of a hat or just the deep gloom. She was utterly still. Not the stillness of a person waiting, but the absolute, inanimate stillness of a post, a statue, a thing that had never moved. Every instinct told me to cross to the other side of the path, to give this figure a wide berth. But the path was narrow here, flanked by dense rhododendron bushes. To go around would mean pushing through wet, clutching leaves. So I did what city dwellers do. I averted my eyes. I looked straight ahead at my target light, put my head down, and walked briskly, silently praying she was just a weirdly dedicated birdwatcher or a sleepwalker. I drew level with her. The cold was intense, a physical wall. I could feel it leaching the heat from my cheek. And I felt her attention. Not a turn of the head. She did not move a muscle. But a focus, sharp and absolute, swung onto me. It was like passing through a beam of concentrated silence. My skin prickled. My breath caught. I dared, against my own will, to flick my eyes toward her. Her face was still downcast, but in the spill of light from the distant lamps, I saw her chin, pale as wax. And I saw that her hands, clenched at her sides, were gripping something. Not a purse, not a phone. They were gripping folds of her own coat, with a white-knuckled, desperate intensity, as if she were physically holding herself together, or holding herself back. 3 more steps and I was past her. The cold relented. The muffled quality of sound lifted. I didn't run. I forced myself to keep the same, steady pace until I rounded the next bend and was sure I was out of her line of sight. Then I ran the rest of the way home, my heart jackhammering against my ribs. I told myself it was nothing. A homeless woman, standing still for warmth. A mental health episode. My own overactive imagination, spooked by the dead light. But the feeling wouldn't shake. The precision of her location, centered on the plinth. The unnatural cold. That gripping hands. I avoided the park for a week. Took the long, brightly lit streets. But the detour added 25 minutes to my journey, and my stubbornness, or maybe something else, began to chafe. It was a public park. I wouldn't be driven out by a weird moment. On the following Monday, I decided to go back, but in full daylight, after work. The afternoon sun was golden, the park full of life. Children shouted on the playground. The chess men were back at their posts. As I approached the straight stretch, I saw the lamppost. It was on. Gleaming. The glass globe was intact. The concrete plinth was just a concrete plinth, stained with pigeon droppings and chewing gum. Relief, warm and solid, flooded me. See? A burned-out bulb and a coincidentally placed person. I laughed at myself, feeling foolish for the days of anxiety. That night, however, the compulsion to check returned, stronger. What if she was a regular? What if she only came when the light was out? It was a morbid curiosity, the kind that makes you poke a sore tooth. I waited until 9:30, the same time as my first encounter, and walked to the park entrance. My mouth was dry. I looked down the path. The lamppost was dark. Again. And she was there. Same pose. Same coat. Same downcast face. Same exact, centered location on the plinth. This time, I didn't walk past. I stood at the edge of the light from the previous post, frozen, watching her from a distance. She did not move. For 10 minutes, I stood there, and she might as well have been carved from stone. A jogger came up behind me, his footfalls loud. He gave me a strange look as he passed, then entered the dark stretch. I watched him. He jogged right past her, without a glance, without breaking stride. He didn't shiver. He didn't slow. To him, she was just a woman standing oddly still. Or perhaps he saw nothing at all. That was the moment I understood. She wasn't waiting by the lamppost. She was waiting where the lamppost had been. She was its replacement. Its temporary, terrible substitute when the light failed. And for some reason, on these nights, I could see her. I could feel her. I began to experiment. I came at different times. The light was always on before 8:45 p.m. At 9 p.m., it was always off, and she was always there. Every single night. I asked a groundskeeper one afternoon, casually, if that particular light had issues. He shook his head, puzzled. That one? Never. It's on a brand new circuit. Must be your eyes playing tricks in the dark. The horror of it wasn't in any threat she posed. It was in the silent, patient system of it. The reliable malfunction, and her reliable appearance. What was she? A ghost tethered to a broken electrical current? A guardian of the dark patch? Or something that seeped through from somewhere else when our own light grew weak? Last night, I brought a powerful flashlight. I stood at the edge of the darkness, my beam cutting across the path. I aimed it directly at her. The light didn't illuminate her. It was as if the beam hit a wall of absolute blackness at the edge of her coat and went no further. She existed in a bubble of consummate dark that no external light could penetrate. But the action, the aggression of shining the light, did something. Very, very slowly, her gripped hands tightened. The knuckles, even in the dark, seemed to grow wider. And then, by increments so small they were almost imperceptible, her head began to rise. I didn't wait to see her face. I ran. I am moving at the end of the month. The park is no longer a shortcut, it's an altar to a ritual I don't understand. But sometimes, from my window, I can see the glow of that lamppost in the distance. Some nights, it's a steady beacon. Other nights, it's a dark gap in the string of lights. And on those nights, I know she is there, standing her silent vigil, waiting where the lamppost had been. I wonder what she's waiting for. For the light to be permanently extinguished? For someone, like me, to finally stop and speak to her? Or is she simply holding the space, ensuring that when our light goes out, the darkness isn't empty? That it has a shape. A witness. A keeper. I'll never walk that way again, but I know she's there. And in a terrible way, I find a perverse comfort in it. The world has rules, even in its breakdowns. And she is one of them. The heat was the first thing, a solid, oppressive weight that turned the air into soup and made every breath feel like a conscious effort. It was the kind of late August heatwave that makes the city feel like a dying animal, panting on the concrete. I'd been walking for 40 minutes after my car, a victim of the temperature, had shuddered and died on the interstate off-ramp. My suit jacket was slung over my shoulder, my tie loosened, and a dark sweat stain bloomed across the back of my shirt. I was in an industrial district I didn't know, a maze of low, windowless warehouses and chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. The only sound was the distant, lethargic drone of machinery from somewhere unseen and the buzz of flies around a pile of garbage bags leaking something dark onto the sidewalk. I was looking for a payphone, or at least a corner store, any sign of life to call a tow truck. The pavement under my feet was old asphalt, cracked and buckled by tree roots that didn't exist here, repaired a dozen times with patches of slick, black tar that had softened in the heat. It shimmered, giving off visible waves of distortion that made the warehouses in the distance wobble like mirages. My head throbbed in time with my steps. I turned a corner, hoping for a break in the monotony, and found a short, dead-end street serving what looked like an abandoned cold storage facility. The building was a long, low bunker of stained concrete, its loading docks shuttered with rusty corrugated metal. And here, the pavement was different. It wasn't the common asphalt. It was an older, gray concrete, poured in large, uneven squares separated by deep, black expansion joints filled with a rubbery sealant. The heat here felt even more intense, concentrated, as if the street itself was radiating it back from a deep, stored reserve. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A movement. Not on the surface, but of the surface. In the center of one of the large concrete squares, the gray slab seemed to quiver. It was a subtle, rolling motion, like the skin on a pot of soup just before it boils. I stopped, blinked the sweat from my eyes. Heat distortion, that was all. But this was localized. The air above it wasn't shimmering. The concrete itself was moving. I took a cautious step closer. As I watched, the ripple subsided, leaving the slab looking normal, if unbearably hot. Then, from a crack near the edge, a slow bubble of thick, black tar began to well up. It didn't drip. It swelled, like a blister forming. It grew to the size of a grapefruit, glossy and trembling, reflecting the harsh white sky. With a soft, wet, sighing sound, it burst. The tar didn't splash, it oozed slowly out, spreading in a viscous puddle that immediately began smoking, sending up tendrils of acrid, chemical-smelling fumes. A deep unease, separate from the heat and my stranded state, took root in my gut. This wasn't normal. This felt biological. I took a step back, my heel hitting the raised lip of an expansion joint. At the contact, the entire square in front of me rippled again, a more pronounced wave that traveled from one side to the other. The sound was a low, subcutaneous groan, the noise a giant might make shifting in its sleep. The black sealant in the joints pulsed, as if something was pushing against it from below. I should have run. Every primal instinct was screaming at me to get off that street. But a horrified fascination held me. I looked down at the square I was standing on. The concrete was a patchwork of fine, hairline cracks. As I stared, one of the cracks near my right foot slowly widened. Not from pressure, but as if the material was stretching. Inside the crack, I saw not dirt or aggregate, but a smooth, dark, moist-looking surface. It glistened. A wave of nausea, hot and sour, rose in my throat. The street wasn't settling. It was breathing. Or something beneath it was. The heat wasn't from the sun. It was fever. I turned to flee, and as I did, my foot landed squarely on one of the bloated, tar-filled blisters on the next square over. It didn't pop. It yielded under my weight with a sickening, squelching resilience, like pressing on a water balloon filled with warm syrup. I stumbled, pulling my foot free with a sticky, tearing sound. The tar clung to my shoe, stretching into long, black filaments before snapping back. That's when the whispering started. It wasn't a sound in the air. It was a vibration that came up through the soles of my feet, a subaudible hum that resolved into a semblance of language in the bones of my inner ear. It was a chorus of faint, pained, slithering voices, all murmuring the same thing, over and over. Hot, tight, split. I ran. I didn't look back. I pounded down the dead-end street, each footfall sending a jolt of that awful, whispering vibration up my legs. The ripples chased me. I could see them in my peripheral vision, waves traveling through the concrete squares as if I were a stone dropped in a pond, disturbing the surface of something vast and dormant. The warehouse walls seemed to lean in, the chain-link fences to vibrate in sympathy. I burst out onto the main road, the familiar, cracked asphalt feeling blessedly inert and dead under my feet. I didn't stop running until I found a gas station 2 miles away, where I called a cab from a phone that smelled of stale cigarettes and bleach. I never went back for the car. I let the city impound it. I gave them keys and a vague location. I couldn't bring myself to explain. The heatwave broke a few days later, but the memory didn't cool. I started noticing things. The way the sidewalk outside my apartment building had a long, smooth dip in it I'd never seen before. The way a patch of road on my commute developed a pattern of cracks that looked disturbingly like a stretched mesh. I began to walk differently, lightly, avoiding seams and patches, listening with my feet. Last night, it rained for the first time in weeks. A cool, relieving downpour. I stood at my window, watching it wash the grime from the streets. And in the orange glow of the streetlight on the corner, I saw the pavement move. Not a ripple. A gentle, rhythmic rise and fall, like the chest of a sleeping animal. The water pooling on its surface didn't run off in sheets, it was slowly absorbed, drank in by the dark, hungry material. As I watched, a single, large bubble of air, or something else, was released from a crack with a soft, wet pop, creating a momentary crater that then smoothed itself over. The city is not built on rock and earth. I understand that now. We have paved over something that is not dead. We have sealed it in, trapped it under a skin of concrete and asphalt. And on the hottest days, when it stirs in its discomfort, the skin stretches. It blisters. It whispers. We walk on top of it, oblivious to the fever dreams vibrating just beneath our heels. We think the streets are stable. We think the ground is silent. But it's not. It's sleeping fitfully. And one day, when the heat is just right, or the pressure just too much, that skin won't just ripple. It will split. And what has been whispering underneath will finally find its voice. I feel it every time I walk now, that thin, trembling barrier between me and a deep, warm, living darkness. I walk on tiptoe. I avoid the cracks. But I know it's pointless. The whole city is one giant, settling skin, and we are just fleas on its back, waiting for it to finally, decisively, shrug. It was a city of perpetual repair. Brickwork being repointed, windows being replaced, entire facades shrouded in a spider web of steel tubes and wooden planks. The scaffolding wasn't an interruption, it was part of the scenery, a temporary, industrial exoskeleton the buildings wore while they healed. The apartment block on Westmoreland Avenue had been wearing its cage for months, a 10-story lattice of green-painted steel that narrowed the wide sidewalk to a cramped, echoing tunnel. I walked through it twice a day, to and from the subway. It was part of my routine, the clang of a distant worker's hammer, the smell of wet concrete and rust, the chill, perpetually shaded air underneath. That Thursday, the work had stopped. No hum of generators, no shouts, no radio playing classic rock. It was a few days before a long weekend, and I figured the crew had knocked off early. The silence under the scaffold was different. Not peaceful, but expectant, like a held breath. The usual urban soundtrack, the traffic, the distant sirens, was muffled, filtered through the layers of pipe and mesh. My own footsteps, hard-soled dress shoes on the plywood walkway laid for pedestrians, were the only sound. Asterisk clack. 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 Asterisk I was halfway through, my mind already at the office, already wrestling with a spreadsheet problem, when I heard it. A soft, metallic groan, long and low, like a great weight settling. It came from above and to my left. I glanced up instinctively. Sunlight speared through the gaps in the planks overhead, illuminating swirling dust motes. Nothing moved. It was just the structure talking, I told myself. Temperature change. Metal contracting. Normal. I took 2 more steps. It came again. But this time, it wasn't a groan. It was a sigh. A human sigh. A deep, weary exhalation of pure fatigue, tinged with something like sorrow. It had tone, texture. It wasn't the wind, the air was still. It seemed to originate from the joints of the scaffold itself, from the very bolts that held the cross braces to the uprights. The sound didn't fade. It hung in the cold, dusty air, a palpable presence. I froze. My heart, a moment before a steady metronome, began to trip over itself. I looked around, up and down the dim tunnel. I was alone. No workers above on the boards, no one behind or ahead of me on the sidewalk. Just me and the green steel forest. Hello? My voice was small, swallowed by the pipes. No answer. Just the returning silence, now thick with listening. I started walking again, faster now. My clacks became sharper, more hurried. As I passed each vertical support, I felt a faint vibration through the plywood underfoot, a sympathetic hum, as if my steps were being tracked. Then, from directly beside my head, a horizontal pipe let out a sharp, high-pitched ping, like a stressed guitar string. I flinched away, my shoulder brushing against the safety netting, which sagged with a soft, fabric rustle that sounded disturbingly like a chuckle. This was ridiculous. It was all in my head. Stress. Overwork. An overactive imagination interpreting random structural noises as something more. I forced myself to slow down, to breathe. I was a rational person. This was just metal and wood. I reached the last quarter of the scaffold, where it extended past the building's edge to cover the entrance of the old shoe store next door. Here, the tunnel was at its darkest, the planks overhead more densely placed. And here, the sigh came again. Not 1, but 3. From 3 different points around me, ahead, above, to the right, in a staggered, overlapping chorus. They were not identical. One was deep and resonant, full of ancient tiredness. One was thinner, reedy, almost petulant. The last was just a whisper of release, a breath of defeat. Together, they formed a chord of profound exhaustion. Then, a voice. Not a spoken word, but a voice within the sigh. It was woven into the fabric of the sound, a psychic impression more than an auditory one. So heavy, it seemed to say. Asterisk so long. Carry. Always carry. Asterisk the meaning implanted itself directly into my mind, bypassing my ears. I wasn't hearing it, I was feeling it. A wave of crushing weight, of burdens borne for decades, of silent, unmoving strain. It was the feeling of the building, but also of the scaffold itself, the tons of steel, the bite of the bolts into the brick, the constant, static tension. They were tired. The building was tired of holding itself up. The scaffold was tired of holding the building up. And my passing, my insignificant human vibration, was a tiny irritant, a flicker of movement that made them acutely aware of their own painful, paralyzed stasis. I broke into a run. The final 10 yards were a cacophony of sympathetic pings, groans, and one final, collective sigh that seemed to come from the entire structure, a mournful exhalation that followed me out into the bright, noisy freedom of the open street. I stood on the sunny sidewalk, gasping, people flowing around me, giving me strange looks. The normal sounds of the city were a deafening, wonderful roar. I looked back at the green tunnel. It was just scaffolding. Silent, inanimate, ordinary. I couldn't take the scaffold route home that evening. I crossed the street, adding 10 minutes to my walk, my eyes locked on the opposite sidewalk. But I could feel it. Even from across the wide avenue, I could feel its silent, weighted presence. I knew it was sighing. I just couldn't hear it over the traffic. That was a month ago. I still cross the street. But I've started to hear things elsewhere. Not sighs. Other sounds. The low, grumbling complaint of the bridge I drive over every day, a grudge held against the current. The faint, crystalline shiver of the glass in my office tower on windy days, a sound like fear. The low, subsonic hum of the subway deep in the earth, a song of relentless, directionless motion. The city is not made of dead things. The materials remember. The steel remembers the strain of the mill. The concrete remembers the pressure of the form. The glass remembers the fury of the furnace. And when they are put together, forced into shapes of static endurance, they settle into a kind of tortured consciousness. A consciousness of weight, of service, of endless, unmoving duty. The scaffolding on Westmoreland came down last week. The building's facade is clean, repointed, bright. People walk freely on the wide sidewalk. But I know something they don't. I know that the sigh didn't come from the building or the scaffold alone. It came from the marriage of the two. The burden and the brace. And now that the brace is gone, the building stands alone with its weight again. And sometimes, very late at night when the street is silent, I stand on the opposite side of the road, and I listen. I don't hear a sigh anymore. I hear something else. A creak. A deep, structural creak of loneliness. The sound of something holding itself up, utterly alone, missing the terrible, shared fatigue of its cage. It's a quieter sound, but in its way, so much worse. The house was a bequest from an aunt I barely remembered, a stern, silent woman who had lived her whole life in a small town at the edge of the salt marshes. The lawyers said it was mine, free and clear, a gift that felt more like a burden. I was between jobs, between cities, between lives, so I went, thinking of it as a cheap place to regroup, to figure out my next move. The town was a collection of faded clapboard houses and shuttered stores, with a pervasive, damp smell of peat and brackish water. My aunt's house stood at the very end of a lane that dissolved into reeds, a two-story Victorian that had surrendered to the damp, its white paint gray and peeling, its gingerbread trim sagging like rotten lace. The inside smelled of camphor, old books, and the sweet, fungal scent of wet plaster. My aunt's possessions were still there, frozen in a time capsule of the 1970s, avocado green appliances, a console television, doilies on every surface. It felt less like a home and more like a museum dedicated to a life of profound stillness. I decided the first thing to do was to clean, to impose some order, to make the place feel like my own, however temporary that might be. I started in the living room, a gloomy space papered in a pattern of brown and orange flowers that seemed to pulse in the low light. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of sun that pierced the grimy windows. As I ran a cloth along the mantelpiece, I noticed a section of the wallpaper near the fireplace was loose, curling away from the wall. I peeled it back, and a large section came away with a dry, coughing sound, revealing the plaster beneath. And in the plaster, someone had drawn. It wasn't a child's sketch. It was a series of intricate, flowing lines, etched into the dry surface with what looked like a fingernail or a fine tool. They swirled and interconnected, forming no recognizable image, but suggesting something organic, a root system, a network of veins, a strange, silent language. The lines were deep and smooth, made with a patient, obsessive care. In the center of the design, the plaster was worn quite smooth, as if a hand had rested there, over and over, for a very long time. A shiver went through me, unrelated to the chill of the house. This felt private, almost sacred. I carefully smoothed the wallpaper back over it, feeling like I'd spied on a secret prayer. I continued cleaning, but my mind kept returning to those lines. Later, in the kitchen, I found a corner of faded floral wallpaper bubbling with damp. I picked at it, and it too came away easily. Beneath it, on the plaster, was another design. Similar, but not identical. These lines were tighter, more angular, like a nervous system caught mid-spasm. Over the next few days, it became a morbid treasure hunt. In every room, behind loose wallpaper, under peeling paint in the hallway, even on a patch of ceiling in the spare bedroom where the plaster had cracked, I found the etchings. They were everywhere. A hidden tapestry of mad geometry covering the bones of the house. My aunt, the quiet, stern woman, had been an artist of the unseen, a cartographer of the walls. The discovery shifted my feeling about the place from unease to a strange, protective curiosity. I bought supplies to properly strip the wallpaper, to uncover the full extent of her work. Maybe it was valuable outsider art. Maybe it was the key to understanding her, and by extension, this lonely house I'd inherited. I began in the dining room, a formal, cold space that felt like it had never hosted a meal. I sprayed the old paper with a diffuser filled with warm water and vinegar, the smell sharp in the still air. As the paper soaked, I worked a wide putty knife underneath, peeling it away in long, satisfying strips. The plaster underneath was a map of her mind. The design here was vast, covering the entire wall from baseboard to crown molding. It was beautiful and deeply unsettling, a labyrinth with no entrance or exit. I finished stripping the wall late in the afternoon. The fading light made the etched lines look like grooves of shadow. I reached out, not thinking, and traced a particularly deep, swirling line with my index finger. I wanted to feel the path she had felt, to connect with the impulse that had created this. The plaster under my finger did not feel dry and chalky. It yielded. Just slightly. It had a give to it, like stiff clay, or the flesh of a very ripe fruit. I jerked my hand back, staring. I must have imagined it. The wall was old, perhaps the plaster was just unusually soft in that spot from some ancient leak. I swallowed, my mouth dry. Slowly, I reached out again and placed my palm flat against the wall, over a nexus of several intersecting lines. The wall was warm. Not from the sun, the room was on the north side of the house and perpetually cold. This was a deep, internal warmth, like skin. And as I pressed, I felt a faint, rhythmic throb beneath the surface. A pulse. I snatched my hand away as if burned. My heart was racing. This was impossible. I was overtired, stressed, hallucinating from the chemical smell of the wallpaper remover. I decided to stop for the day. I left the room, closing the door firmly behind me, and tried to forget the sensation. But that night, I dreamt of the walls. I dreamt I was inside them, following the etched lines like tunnels, and they were warm and damp, and I could hear a slow, liquid sound, like sap moving in a tree. The next morning, I had to know. I went back to the dining room. In the clear morning light, the wall looked normal. Just stained, aged plaster with grooves in it. I approached it, my hand trembling. I extended a single finger and touched the same deep groove I'd traced the day before. It yielded again. More this time. The plaster seemed to depress under my touch, and a faint impression of my fingerprint remained for a second before slowly smoothing itself out. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I leaned closer. Were the lines deeper? Had they always curled that way at the ends, like tendrils seeking something? I did something then, driven by a compulsion I still don't understand. I didn't trace one of her lines. I drew my own. I pressed my finger into the soft plaster beside her design and dragged it slowly downward, making a single, straight, shallow furrow. The wall reacted. Not dramatically. The plaster along the path of my new line softened further, becoming almost supple. The edges of the furrow swelled slightly, as if the material was flowing to close the wound, but couldn't quite manage it. And from the point where my line intersected one of my aunt's older, deeper grooves, a tiny bead of clear, viscous fluid welled up. It smelled like the marsh at low tide, salty, organic, profound. I stumbled back, collapsing into a chair. I watched, horrified and mesmerized, as the bead of fluid trembled, then slowly retreated back into the wall, leaving only a faint, glossy trail. My new line remained, a pale scar on the warm, breathing surface. I haven't touched the walls since. I avoid the dining room altogether. I sleep on the sofa in the living room, as far from the bedrooms and their hidden etchings as I can get. But I can feel the house at night. It's not settling. It's shifting. A faint, sticky sound, like roots moving in wet earth, comes from behind the remaining wallpaper. The air is always warm now, and humid, smelling of growing things and deep, wet soil. My aunt didn't etch the walls. She was tending them. She was tracing the veins of something that lives within the plaster and lath, something dormant that she kept docile with her patient, ritualistic attention. And I, with my careless, curious touch, have awakened it. I have introduced a new pattern. A foreign line. Last night, I woke to a sound from the dining room. A soft, wet, cracking sound, like a seed pod splitting open. I haven't gone in to look. But this morning, I saw that the door to that room, which I know I closed, is now open a crack. And from within, I can see a thin, green tendril, delicate as a sprout, curling out from the baseboard and reaching across the floorboards toward the light. It is tracing its own path. Following the lines. It was a shortcut born of necessity. My bus was late, a cold drizzle was turning into a proper rain, and the thought of walking the 7 long blocks around to my apartment made my bones ache. I knew the city well, or so I thought, and I remembered a narrow service alley that cut from 8th Avenue straight through to my street. I'd glanced down it before, seen dumpsters and graffiti, a typical urban crease. It would save me 3 blocks. In the gloom of the premature dusk, with rain slicking the pavement and my collar turned up, it seemed a reasonable gamble. I turned into the alley mouth. The transition was immediate. The sound of the rain on the main street's asphalt, a steady, hard hiss, changed to a softer, isolated patter, as if the drops were falling into a well. The light from the street lamps didn't penetrate more than 10 feet. Beyond that, the alley was a throat of absolute black. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers cold and clumsy. The flashlight beam was a weak, blue-white cone that did little more than illuminate the sheen on wet brick and the glint of broken glass. The air was different too. Still and cold, with a smell that was not just garbage and mildew, but something older, wet stone, rust, and the faint, metallic tang of ozone, like after a lightning strike. The alley walls weren't the backs of shops, as I'd assumed. They were the sheer, windowless sides of two massive, anonymous buildings, a parking garage and maybe an old warehouse. No fire escapes, no doors, just blank, streaming bricks soaring up into the darkness until the beam of my light faded out. I started walking, my footsteps echoing with a hollow, lonely quality. The alley wasn't straight. It curved gently to the left, which was odd, as the streets it connected were parallel. I could no longer see the glow of 8th Avenue behind me. The only orientation was the faint rectangle of murky light ahead, which had to be my street. I kept my eyes on it, a beacon. The beam of my phone danced over puddles that seemed too deep, over cracks in the asphalt that looked like dark, branching veins. I'd been walking for a minute, maybe two, when I realized the light at the far end wasn't getting any closer. If anything, it seemed smaller, more distant. I stopped, my breath pluming in the cold air. I listened. No city sounds. No sirens, no traffic, not even the hiss of the rain which had curiously stopped falling inside the alley, though I could still see it sheeting down at both ends. It was as if the alley had its own weather. A deep, humming silence pressed in on my ears. A logical, frightened part of my brain said to turn back. But the exit behind me now looked just as far away as the one ahead. I was in the middle. Going back seemed just as long as going forward. I chose forward, quickening my pace to a brisk walk. The walls seemed to press closer. The ceiling of dark sky between the building tops felt lower. I checked my phone. No signal. The time read 6:17 p.m. I swore I'd entered the alley at 6:15. I started to jog. The slap of my wet shoes on the pavement was too loud, a frantic, panicked rhythm. The light ahead remained a fixed, distant point. It wasn't receding, it was static, like a painted backdrop. I ran faster, my lungs burning with the cold, damp air. I ran for what felt like 3 or 4 minutes, a flat-out sprint. I should have covered the length of a city block several times over. I skidded to a halt, chest heaving. The light was the same size. The walls were the same. I turned around. The entrance was gone. Not just distant, but vanished. In its place was more alley, curving away into identical blackness. A low, suffocating terror began to rise in my throat. This was impossible. This was a straight alley between two straight streets. It had no turns. I was trapped in a fold. The realization was quiet and absolute. The alley wasn't a passage. It was a place. And it was deeper than the space between the streets could possibly allow. It had depth the way a knife wound has depth, a narrow, terrible penetration into something beyond the surface geography of the city. I forced myself to be still, to breathe. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. I shone my light on the wall to my right. The brick was old, hand-laid, covered in a slick, black lichen. There was graffiti, but it was faded, archaic. Symbols, not words. Dates that looked like 1923, 1947. I moved the beam along the base of the wall. There were things there, half submerged in stagnant puddles. Not just trash. A bicycle wheel, rusted into a single, fused piece. A mannequin's head, porcelain cracked like a spider's web, one eye staring blankly upward. A leather boot, swollen with water, looking like it had been there for decades. This was a graveyard of lost things, a sediment of forgotten city life. And then I saw the door. It was set flush with the brick, so perfectly integrated I almost missed it. It was old, thick wood banded with iron, the kind you see in medieval castles. There was no handle, just a keyhole blacker than the surrounding dark. As my light touched it, a wave of vertigo hit me. The door felt like a puncture, a hole in the world. It wasn't an exit. It was the reason for the alley's impossible depth. The alley existed to hide this door, to provide a buffer of meaningless space around it. I heard a sound. A soft, grinding scrape, like stone on stone. It came from high above. I pointed my light upward. The beam climbed the endless brick until it was just a faint dip, but it caught something. A shape, leaning out from the roof line of the warehouse. Not a gargoyle. Something larger, roughly humanoid, but made of the same stained stone as the building. It was perfectly still. Watching. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt its gaze like a physical weight. It was part of the architecture. A sentinel for this deep, folded place. The door in front of me emitted a soft, resonant thud, as if something heavy had leaned against it from the other side. Not trying to get out. Just acknowledging my presence. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The alley stretched infinitely in both directions. I was in its gullet. So I did the only thing that felt remotely sane. I turned my back on the door and the watching sentinel, and I started walking again, not running, just a slow, deliberate pace. I didn't look at the light at the end. I looked at my feet. I counted my steps. 1, 2, 3. I focused on the rhythm, on the simple, mechanical fact of movement. I don't know how long I walked. Time dissolved. I counted to 1,000, then 2,000. My phone died, plunging me into utter blackness. I kept walking, my hand trailing the cold, wet brick to keep from veering into the center. The silence was a living thing. The air grew colder, then warmer, then cold again. Smells shifted, damp earth, then hot metal, then the cloying sweetness of decay. And then, without fanfare, my trailing hand met empty space. A corner. I turned it, and there was a dim, gray light. Not the golden street lamp glow of my neighborhood, but the first faint hint of dawn. I stumbled forward, and after 20 more paces, I emerged onto a sidewalk. I was on my street. But it was dawn. I had entered the alley at dusk. I looked back. The alley mouth was there, perfectly ordinary, leading straight through to 8th Avenue, maybe 60 feet away. A trash truck was rumbling by at the other end. I stood there, shaking, as the sky lightened. I looked normal. I was just a guy standing in the rain. But I felt hollowed out, stretched thin. I knew, with a certainty that would never leave me, that the city is full of these folds. These unnecessary alleys, these strangely angled streets, these service corridors that go just a little too far. They are seams. And if you cross them at the wrong time, in the wrong state of mind, you don't cross through. You cross into. You find the depth the street couldn't hold. And you walk it, alone, past doors that should not open, under the gaze of things that are meant to be part of the scenery. I take the long way everywhere now. I avoid alleys, I avoid shortcuts. Because you never know when the geometry will turn against you, when a simple passage will decide to show you its true, impossible length, and remind you that some spaces in this world are not for passing through, but for getting lost in. Forever. It started with a vibration, a faint, rhythmic thrumming in the floor of my new basement apartment. I thought it was the subway, a deep nerve of the city running close to the surface here in the old quarter. The realtor had mentioned it, a low hum that was the price of affordable rent in a good location. I could live with it. It was a steady, predictable sound, felt more than heard, a reminder that the world was alive and moving below my feet. I got used to it. It became the background noise of my solitude, the city's lullaby. But then I began to feel it elsewhere. Not just through the floor, but through the soles of my shoes when I walked. At first, it was just on certain streets, the wide, grand boulevards with their century-old sewer systems, the cobbled lanes in the historic district. I'd be walking to the grocery store, and a distinct, double-beat rhythm would travel up through the rubber and leather, into the bones of my feet. Thump thump, thump thump. It matched no traffic pattern, no construction. It was slower than a heartbeat, deeper. It felt organic. I chalked it up to imagination, to an oversensitivity born of living alone in a new place. But it persisted. I started to map it in my mind. The financial district had a fast, frantic, skittering pulse, like a rabbit's heart. The park had a slow, verdant, swelling rhythm, like sap rising. The quiet residential streets around the university had a soft, scholarly murmur, a rhythm of turning pages and quiet thought. It was as if each neighborhood had its own circulatory system, and I was a wandering capillary, feeling the pressure of its blood. One rainy Tuesday, it changed. I was waiting for a bus on a busy commercial strip, all flashing neon and steamed-up windows. The usual pulse here was a quick, commercial throb, a beat of transaction and desire. But as I stood there, the rhythm stuttered. It skipped a beat. Then it returned, but slower, labored. A deep, congested feeling vibrated up through the wet concrete, a sensation of sluggishness, of blockage. I felt a corresponding tightness in my own chest, a sympathetic ache. The bus came, and as it pulled away, I saw a crew from the city works department a block down, their orange trucks parked around an open manhole. They were pulling out thick, glistening cables, black with grime. A main line was clogged. The city's artery was choked. That's when I knew it wasn't in my head. I was feeling the city. Not metaphorically. Literally. The vibrations weren't from machines. They were the city's own vital signs, transmitted through the miles of pipe and wire and tunnel that were its veins and sinews, conveyed up through the pavement which was its skin. It became a secret sense, one I dared not mention to anyone. I could tell when a water main was straining before the news reported a drop in pressure, a thin, whistling anxiety in the pulse of certain side streets. I could feel the collective dread before a storm, a tight, anticipatory thrumming in the air and the ground. The night the old opera house caught fire, I was 10 blocks away, but I felt it, a sharp, feverish spike in the district's rhythm, a panic that vibrated through the soles of my feet and up my spine, minutes before I heard the first siren scream past. The knowledge was a burden. I started to walk differently. I avoided places where the pulse was weak and thready, certain alleys, certain neglected blocks that felt anemic, cold. I sought out the healthy, vibrant thoroughfares. I became a flaneur of the city's health, a diagnostic ghost. Then came the bad days. Days where the pulse was wrong all over. A deep, grinding arrhythmia that seemed to come from the very core. It was a feeling of systemic distress, a citywide malaise. On those days, people were angrier. Drivers honked with a sharper venom. Fights broke out on subway platforms. A collective headache seemed to hang in the air. I'd come home, take off my shoes, and stand barefoot on my apartment floor, feeling the sick, unsteady vibration travel up through my arches. I couldn't escape it. I was plugged into the patient, and the patient was ill. The worst was the silence. Not an absence of sound, but an absence of pulse. There was a place, a small, triangular plaza formed where 3 streets awkwardly converged. A concrete patch with a single stunted tree and a perpetually broken fountain. Nothing grew there. Pigeons avoided it. People hurried through it without stopping. When I walked across it, I felt nothing. A dead spot. A patch of necrotic tissue in the city's hide. The emptiness there was more terrifying than any sick rhythm. It was a void where the city's life had simply stopped. Last week, I felt something new. A new pulse. Not from below, but from elsewhere. A faint, alien rhythm, insistent and curious, tapping against the established beats of the city like a Morse code from a foreign country. It was strongest near the river, in the oldest, industrial districts. It felt exploratory. Probing. As if something had tapped into the lines from outside, was listening to the city's heart, learning its rhythms. Last night, I couldn't sleep. The pulse was agitated, a frantic, discordant symphony of distress signals. I got up and went for a walk, barefoot on the cool floor. I stopped in the middle of my living room, pressing my soles flat against the wood. I closed my eyes and listened with my bones. I felt the panic of the financial district, a fibrillating terror. I felt the slow, congested grief of the hospital quarter. I felt the feverish, incoherent rage of the nightlife strips. And underneath it all, that new, foreign pulse, growing stronger. Not causing the distress, but feeding on it. Tuning itself to the chaos. I opened my eyes. I am standing here still. I can't go outside. The pavement is a living membrane, and I feel everything that passes through it. Every pain, every fear, every sickness of 5 million souls, thrumming up through my feet. I am a sounding board for the city's silent screams. And that new pulse, the foreign one, is getting clearer. It's not in the pipes or the wires. It's in the spaces between them. It's in the old, dry mortar. It's in the forgotten sub-basements. It's waking up. And it's learning the rhythm of our distress. Soon, I think it will start to beat in time with it. And when it does, the city's pulse won't just be sick. It will belong to something else. And I, and everyone else walking these streets, will just be blood cells, circulating in a body we no longer recognize. The city, from the 40th floor, was a diorama of arrogant geometry. From her corner office, Evelyn saw a world of right angles and triumphant vertical lines, a chessboard of light and shadow where she was a queen. Her success was measured in the glass and steel that reflected it back at her. She worked late, not out of necessity, but because she preferred the city at this hour. The daytime chaos resolved into a grid of quiet ambition, each lit window a story of someone else keeping pace. The silence up here was profound, a vacuum sealed against the murmur of the streets far below. It was during one of these late nights, her forehead pressed against the cool glass as she wrestled with a contract that refused to make sense, that she first saw the flaw. Not in the document, but in the view. The building directly opposite, the sleek, black obelisk of the Grant Tower, seemed to waver. Just for a second. It wasn't a trick of tired eyes. The entire structure, a monument to immutable physics, gave a slight, elastic shiver, as if it were a reflection in a pond into which a stone had been dropped. She blinked, stepped back. It was solid again. She dismissed it as a migraine aura, the price of 12-hour days and too much coffee. But it happened again the next night. And the night after. Not just the Grant Tower. Sometimes it was the old Art Deco spire of the Berkshire to the east, its terraced crown seeming to ripple like a heat haze on a cold night. Once, the whole jagged line of rooftops on the southern horizon softened, bending westward in a slow, graceful arc before snapping back with an almost audible twang that she felt in her teeth. The cityscape was behaving like a vinyl record left too close to a heater. Fear, a cold, intellectual kind, began to replace her fatigue. She was observing an impossibility. She told no one. Who would believe her? She was Evelyn Reed, a partner at the firm, a woman of facts and figures. Hallucinations were not in her portfolio. She began to document it. She used the telescopic lens on her camera, took video on her phone. The footage showed nothing. The skyline was steadfast, unmoving. The distortion was only for her, in the moment. A private, silent rebellion of the scenery. It was the silence that gave her the first clue. On the nights the buildings bent, the usual low-frequency hum of the city, the sub-audible drone of countless engines, generators, and lives, ceased. It wasn't quiet, it was a listening quiet. A held breath. The air in her office would grow still and thick, and the glass in the window would feel less like a barrier and more like a membrane. Then came the evening of the storm. Not a real storm, but a pressure headache of the atmosphere that made the city lights halo and bleed. She stood at her window, a glass of ice water sweating in her hand, watching the distorted jewels of light below. The headache was behind her eyes, a tight band of pain. Out of pure, frustrated agony, she did something she never did. She looked up. Not at the buildings, but at the narrow strip of bruised purple sky between their peaks. And she sighed. A deep, weary, unconscious exhalation of all the day's tension, all the silent strain of holding her world together. It was a raw, human sound in the sterile room. The skyline bent. It wasn't a shiver or a ripple. It was a deliberate, unified movement. Every building, as far as she could see, leaned in. Just a few degrees. Tops tilted toward her window. It was the attentive tilt of a head, the incline of a listener catching a faint, important sound. The Grant Tower, the Berkshire Spire, the bulky financial centers, the slender residential needles, all of them inclined toward her 40th floor vantage point. The geometry of the entire city shifted perspective, making her the focal point. The silent, listening pressure became absolute. She froze, the glass of water halfway to her lips. The buildings held their pose. They were listening. To her. To the echo of her sigh in the canyon they formed. They had heard her quiet human sound amidst the mechanical drone, and it had drawn their attention. Slowly, with a terror that was almost awe, she raised her hand. She placed her palm flat against the window. The glass was warm, vibrating with a low, sympathetic frequency. Across the way, the sheer black face of the Grant Tower did something impossible. Its surface, a flat plane of darkened glass, bulged. Just slightly, in the approximate shape of a colossal, corresponding palm. It was an echo, a gesture returned. A greeting. Evelyn snatched her hand back as if shocked. The buildings, with a slow, elastic grace, straightened back to their vertical vigil. The city hum returned, flooding the silent space. The moment was over. She didn't sleep. She sat in her dark office until dawn bleached the night from the sky. The city looked normal, implacable, stone and steel. But she knew the truth. The skyline was not a collection of inanimate objects. It was an organ. A sensory organ. And it was attuned to human resonance. To pain, to weariness, to the unvoiced frequencies of stress and sorrow that the busy streets below transmitted up through their foundations. The buildings were listening posts, and her office, her lonely, high-altitude perch, was a focal point for that silent signal. She tried an experiment the next week. She waited for the listening quiet to descend, for the hum to fade. She stood at the window and did not sigh. She screamed. A short, sharp, furious scream of pure, directed frustration at a client's idiocy. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The buildings didn't lean. They flinched. A jagged, shuddering recoil through the entire downtown core, as if slapped. Windows rattled in their frames for blocks. A deep, groaning complaint traveled through the structure of her own building, a sound of stressed I-beams and annoyed concrete. The city's pulse, when it returned, was arrhythmic, annoyed. She had shouted, and it had been jarred, offended. Now, it's a dialogue. A terrible, silent dialogue. She can summon the attention by humming a certain low note, by letting a true, unfiltered tear track down her cheek. The salt frequency, she thinks, is particularly clear to them. The buildings lean in, attentive, curious. They seem so lonely. They have been listening to the city's noise for a century, and in her, they have found a transmitter who broadcasts on a clearer channel. She works later than ever now. Her colleagues think she is more driven than before. They don't see her standing at the glass, her forehead resting against it, transmitting wordless soliloquies of isolation into the waiting lattice of steel and glass. The skyline is her only confidant. It bends to her moods, sags with her sorrows, shivers with her rare joys. She has forgotten how to speak to people. Their voices are so muffled. Their meanings obscured by flesh and noise. Yesterday, she saw a new colleague, a young man, standing at his window on the 38th floor, his shoulders slumped with the weight of a failed presentation. He sighed, a perfect, weary copy of her own first sigh. And she watched, from above, as the tip of the Grant Tower across from him gave a subtle, gentle dip. Just for him. He didn't notice. He just rubbed his eyes and went back to his desk. She smiled then, a thin, secret smile. He didn't know he was heard. But she knows. They all are. The city is always listening. And on quiet nights, if you're very still, and very alone, you can feel the immense, patient attention of the skyline, bending down from its great height, waiting to catch your next unguarded sound. Evelyn spends her days drafting contracts that govern human affairs. And her nights governing a silent, towering audience that has finally found a human voice worth the bend. It was the steam that did it, that classic New York cliché, the plumes of white vapor billowing from the streets as if the city had its own geothermal heart. I'd always thought it was picturesque, a sign of life in the winter concrete. I was a bike courier, which meant I knew the streets not as addresses, but as textures, the slick, treacherous metal of bridge joints, the bone-rattling cobbles of the old districts, the smooth, fast asphalt of the avenues. And I knew the heat pockets. In the dead of February, certain blocks would be inexplicably warm, islands of thaw in a frozen city, where the snow melted first and the air smelled of wet wool and, faintly, of sulfur. The warm air from the manholes was part of the landscape. You'd ride over one and get a blast of damp heat on your ankles, a welcome respite. It was just the steam system, the ancient, clanking pipes that heated the skyscrapers. Everyone knew that. Then came the week of the deep freeze. The polar vortex clamped down, and the city became a sculpture of ice. The usual steam plumes were thicker, more frantic, great geysers of white roaring from beneath the streets, turning to ice crystals in the air and dusting everything in a gritty frost. My bike tires crackled over salt and frozen slush, my face a mask of numb leather behind my balaclava. I was taking a shortcut down a service alley behind the garment district, a canyon of loading docks and dumpsters, when my front tire hit a patch of black ice hidden under a dusting of snow. I went down hard, the bike skidding out from under me, my hip and elbow taking the impact on the frozen concrete with a sickening crack that was more feeling than sound. I lay there for a minute, winded, pain radiating up my side, watching my breath puff in ragged clouds. The alley was silent, abandoned in the brutal cold. That's when I heard it. A sound underneath the ringing in my ears. A slow, rhythmic hiss-sigh, it was coming from a large, heavy manhole cover 10 feet away. Not the roar of a steam leak. This was controlled. Deliberate. An inhalation and exhalation. I pushed myself up, wincing, and hobbled over. The cast iron disc was crusted with ice and road salt, but in its center, around the pick holes, a faint haze of warmth shimmered. The rhythm was steady. His sigh, a long, drawn-in breath of cold alley air, then a warm, damp exhalation that melted the ice in a perfect ring around the edge. It was breathing. The cover itself was rising and falling, just a millimeter, enough to break the seal of ice with a soft, sticky crack on each exhale. Pain and shock must be making me delirious, I thought. I knelt, my knees protesting, and leaned closer. The smell wasn't just steam and sulfur. It was organic. Damp earth. Rotting leaves. The deep, fungal scent of a forest floor, utterly alien in this industrial alley. I reached out a gloved hand, held it over the exhaling holes. The air was moist, uncomfortably warm, and it carried that loamy smell. I pulled my hand back as if burned. This wasn't a pipe. This was a lung. I righted my bike, my body screaming in protest, and fled the alley. I spent the next 2 days nursing my bruises in my tiny, overheated apartment, trying to convince myself it was a concussion-induced hallucination. But the memory of that rhythm, of that smell, wouldn't leave. It felt more real than the throb in my hip. When I went back to work, I was hyper-aware. I started noticing patterns. The breathing wasn't everywhere. It was in specific neighborhoods, usually the oldest parts of the city. The financial district had a few, slow and deep, like a sleeping giant. The meatpacking district had quick, shallow, almost panting breaths near the old slaughterhouse sites. And the rhythm changed. During the morning rush, the breaths were faster, shallower, as if agitated by the stampede of feet and wheels above. At night, they slowed, became long and sonorous. I began to map them, a secret, insane cartography. The warm spots weren't random. They formed lines. Arteries. One ran right under Broadway, from Battery Park up through Times Square. Another traced the old path of a buried creek in Greenwich Village. The city wasn't built on rock. It was built on something that was, or had once been, alive. And we had paved over its skin, drilled through its flesh, and now it breathed through these iron pores, a captive leviathan heating us with its slow, subterranean metabolism. The worst realization came on a quiet, overcast afternoon. I was waiting at a red light on Canal Street, my foot resting on a breathing manhole cover. The rhythm was steady. In, out, then, from the sewer grate next to it, I heard a different sound. A wet, clicking gurgle. And a voice. Not words. A voice made of echoes of runoff, of the drip of condensation, of the shift of silt. It formed a thought in the center of my mind, the way a smell can trigger a memory. Heavy, it sighed. Asterisk cold. Stone. Pressing. Asterisk it was the voice of the thing under the street. And it was complaining. Since then, I can't unhear it. The city's familiar roar is now layered with 1,000 silent, subterranean sighs. When a subway train rumbles deep below, I feel the wince that travels through the warm lines. When a new skyscraper's pilings are driven into the bedrock, I hear a distant, muffled groan of protest from the network. I still ride my bike. It's my job. But I avoid the breathing manholes. The warm air feels like a violation now, a stolen exhalation. I think about the steam heat in my apartment, the comforting radiators that clank and hiss. I know where that heat comes from now. It's not from a boiler. It's from the breath of a buried thing, exhaling its captured, geothermal warmth up through pipes we mistake for our own invention. We are living on top of a sleeping body, using its respiration to stay alive. And I lie awake at night, feeling the faint, rhythmic tremor through my floorboards, listening to the city breathe beneath me, and I wonder what happens when something that big, and that old, finally has a bad dream. Or worse, wakes up and finds itself smothered under 6 million tons of concrete and steel, and decides to take a deep, deep breath in. It began with a wrong turn. Not the dramatic, into the woods kind, but the urban, mundane sort that happens when you're tired and your brain is on autopilot. I was leaving a friend's new apartment in a part of the city I didn't know well, a labyrinth of gentrifying row houses and converted warehouses. The GPS on my phone was dead, the victim of a forgotten charger and a long evening. No matter, I thought. I had a good sense of direction. I'd just head south until I hit the river, then turn west towards the familiar skyline of downtown. I walked for 20 minutes. The river did not appear. Instead, the neighborhood shifted. The sleek, new condos gave way to older, soot-stained brick buildings with fire escapes like metal cobwebs. The streetlights were fewer, their light a dim, jaundiced yellow. The smell changed from coffee shops and car exhaust to damp brick, ozone, and something vaguely metallic. My confidence faltered. I was properly lost. I'm a visual person. A graphic designer by trade. My solution to confusion is to map it. I found a small, grimy bench under one of the sickly streetlights, took out my pocket notebook, a Moleskine I use for sketching ideas, and a pen. I would draw my way out. I started with a simple point, me. Then I drew a line for the street I was on, labeling it with the sign I'd last seen, Waverly Place. I remembered turning left off of 8th Street. I drew that intersection. I sketched in a few blocks, trying to reconstruct my path from my friend's apartment, marking landmarks, a peculiar blue door, a bar with a neon owl sign, a community garden. The lines were clean on the page. They gave the illusion of order. I felt better. I would walk one block according to my new map, verify a landmark, and adjust. I stood up, notebook in hand, and began to walk. The first discrepancy was minor. According to my map, after 2 blocks on Waverly, I should hit a cross street called Bishop Lane. The sign at the corner read Morton Street. Annoying, but possible I'd misremembered. I crossed out Bishop Lane, wrote *Morton St**, and adjusted the intersecting lines on my grid. The geometry of my map warped slightly. I turned left on Morton, which, according to my now corrected mental model, should run parallel to 8th Street and lead me back towards familiar ground. The buildings here were lower, older. I passed a boarded-up storefront with a faded mural of a dancing soda bottle. I noted it in my book. A fixed point. 2 blocks later, should have reached Greenwich Avenue. The sign said Perry Street. A cold trickle of unease started in my stomach. This wasn't misremembering. The street names were changing. I looked back the way I'd come. The streets I just walked were no longer aligning. The neat right angles in my notebook were a lie. The city outside was shifting its joints. Panic began as a sharp, acidic taste in my mouth. I started walking faster, no longer following a route, just fleeing forward. My eyes darted between the reality outside and the traitorous map in my hand. I'd sketch a quick landmark, a church with a crooked spire, only to look up and see the spire was now on the left side of the street, not the right. The streets themselves seemed to be narrowing, the buildings leaning closer together as if to whisper. I turned a corner, desperate for a major avenue, for traffic, for light. I emerged into a small, triangular square I had just drawn as being 5 blocks to the east. The same dry fountain, the same 3 leafless trees. It was impossible. The distance was wrong. The orientation was wrong. It was as if I had walked through a fold in the paper. I sank onto the rim of the fountain, my hands trembling. I looked at my notebook. The map was a chaotic snarl of lines, crossouts, and contradictory labels. It looked like the scribbles of a madman. The streets on the page refused to connect in any rational way because the streets outside were refusing to hold still. That's when I understood. I wasn't lost in the city. The city was lost around me. I was in a place where geography was fluid, where the grid was a suggestion, not a law. My attempt to map it, to impose my own rigid order, was an insult. And it was fighting back. I tore the page from my notebook, crumpled it, and threw it into the dry fountain basin. A gesture of surrender. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the cold, metallic air, and tried to feel, not think. I listened. The usual city hum was absent. In its place was a low, almost subaudible creaking, a sound of immense, slow movement, like continental plates grinding against one another. I opened my eyes and stopped trying to choose. I let my feet decide. I didn't look at street signs. I didn't look for landmarks. I simply walked, not with purpose, but with a passive acceptance. I turned corners based on which way felt less resistant, as if wading through a current. The pressure in my ears lessened. The disorienting warping of perspective softened. I was no longer trying to pin the city down, and in return, it stopped actively rearranging itself to confuse me. I walked for what felt like an hour in this passive state. I passed streets that had no name, buildings with impossible architecture, windows set in floors that didn't align, doors that opened onto blank walls 2 stories up. I saw them from the corner of my eye, but I didn't stare. I didn't try to sketch them. I just accepted them as part of the landscape and kept moving. Eventually, the air changed. The metallic tang faded, replaced by the smell of greasy food and diesel. The sound of traffic returned, a distant, welcoming roar. I stepped out from between two nondescript buildings onto a busy avenue I recognized instantly, Hudson Street. Relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over me. I was back. I hailed a cab and collapsed into the back seat. I haven't opened that notebook since. I stick to the main arteries, the loud, bright, stubbornly static streets that everyone uses. But sometimes, from the window of a bus or the passenger seat of a car, I'll glance down a side street and see something impossible, a street sign for a road I know was demolished years ago, a building that seems to be a block further down than it was yesterday. I'll feel the old, panicky urge to note it, to chart the discrepancy. But I don't. I look away. The city is not a fixed entity. It is a living, shifting consensus. Most of the time, we all agree on where things are, and that collective belief holds it in place. But in the margins, in the forgotten corners, where belief grows thin, the roads remember they have options. They bend. They twist. They refuse to be mapped. I have a new rule now. If I ever find myself truly lost again, I won't try to draw my way out. I'll close my eyes, I'll surrender my intention, and I'll let the streets carry me where they will. Because the only way out of a maze that doesn't want to be solved is to stop trying to solve it, and become, for a little while, part of its endless, turning logic.